Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Kelly White. He's the founder and CEO of Recon, a MasterCard company. Kelly, good to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tom. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
And let's talk about your study that Recon just completed. You looked at 1,000 destructive ransomware attacks. I guess by definition, they're destructive. What did you hope to learn? It looks like you were going a little bit deeper than simply counting and adding up the attacks.
Yeah. So the purpose of the study was to measure the cybersecurity hygiene of victims of destructive ransomware attacks at the time of the event, and compare that with a larger population to see if cybersecurity hygiene actually has an effect on the frequency of destructive ransomware events. Now, a couple of surrounding points to clarify this study. First of all, why destructive ransomware events? Ransomware events are very broad, and I think in a lot of ways, even data theft is often flagged as a ransomware event if the data is being held for ransom. So we had to separate between, well, okay, there's data theft, which has been with us a long time, from destructive ransomware events, which are relatively new, where, starting, I don't know, maybe it was as early as 2012, but we really started getting traction on publicly reporting destructive ransomware events in around 2016, where criminals were detonating malicious software inside of organizations and encrypting the systems, and thus rendering the organization unable to use those systems in their operations. And why we were keenly interested in that segment of ransomware event is because it represents a particularly deep compromise where criminals have to, number one, gain access to the environment, but two, they also have to pivot into systems that are operationally important to the organization. If a system gets encrypted that's of no use, that's not what's part of this study. We're talking about systems like patient healthcare record systems getting encrypted for healthcare organization, and ERP systems for manufacturing organizations and so on. These are the things that take an organization down to its knees. So they're particularly impactful. Sure. And backed up by a very deep compromise. Now, one other point, the data behind this is backed by Recon's cybersecurity ratings and assessment system, which continuously monitors the cybersecurity hygiene of the internet-facing presence of over 5 million companies. And so when a ransomware event happens, we're able to look at our data and say, okay, what were the cybersecurity conditions of that company at the time the ransomware is detonated? So we have a good data set. And again, I think a very compelling question that we're pursuing the answer to, which is, does cybersecurity hygiene influence the frequency of ransomware events?
And you've been able to quantify the correlation between the susceptibility to ransomware attacks, destructive ransomware attacks, and the practices, the cybersecurity hygiene of a given organization. Tell us more about that methodology and what you did find out.
Yeah, so the short answer on the correlation is that companies that have very poor cybersecurity hygiene have a 50 times higher frequency of ransomware events than those that have very good cybersecurity hygiene. Now, what does this very good and very poor hygiene mean? Okay, we talked about that Recon's continuously monitoring the cybersecurity hygiene of over 5 million companies across the world using passive and open source intelligence techniques. What we did is we took the 1,000 ransomware event victims on the day of ransomware detonation and compared their cybersecurity hygiene with that of a larger population of 180,000 companies that Risk Recon has particularly closely supervised cybersecurity assessments of, so very accurate and complete assessments of. And again, quite an astounding number. The companies that are rated as a D or an F in cybersecurity hygiene, 50 times higher rate ransom event are A rated. Now, drilling it down into the specific percentages, 2% of companies that have a D or F cybersecurity hygiene rating have had one or more destructive ransomware events since 2016. When you compare that with the A-rated population, only 0.04% of A-rated organizations have had a destructive ransomware event. So those with the worst cybersecurity, 20 out of 1,000. Those with the best in that higher tier, 0.4 out of 1,000. So there's a very stark difference. And
let me ask you this.
The thing that really, yeah.
Kelly, let me just get a question in here about the fact that if there is a high correlation with low cyber hygiene, does that mean the hackers are aware of what's going on or not going on in a particular target? Or do they just troll around and find out where they can easily get in? That is to say, if you know what a company's posture is, could someone else know what it is?
You're spot on. When you're doing business on the internet, you can't help but reveal your cybersecurity state and the robustness of that cybersecurity. And so we do see, we at Risk Recon are certainly doing this at a massive scale and have massive visibility into the details of the cybersecurity hygiene of organizations' internet-facing systems. But like you say, that doesn't mean that criminals don't have that same visibility. And they are pursuing, like water, the path of least resistance in their opportunities. And this is backed up so if you look at a study that Coveware, a company out of New Zealand, publishes quarterly. They're a big ransomware response company, so they have a lot of visibility into the details of destructive ransomware events. And 85%, according to their Q2 22 report, 85% of those initial compromise vectors come through one of three vectors. They're exploiting some internet-facing software vulnerability, some critical or high-severity software vulnerability that should have been patched. That represents 20% of the initial compromises. 30% of the initial compromises are simply exploiting an unsafe network service that an organization has left open on the internet or has not properly secured. We're talking about things like database listeners that shouldn't be out there, remote desktop protocol services that aren't hardened or don't have multi-factor authentication, things like that. Or they're gaining initial entry through a phishing attack through which they deploy malicious software. And so the criminals are taking advantage of these paths of least resistance to infiltrate organizations. And this shows up in the data.
Sure. And so that leads us to what I think should be a must-read chart for people interested in this problem. You've got a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 unsafe practices that can leave you open to ransomware attacks, make you a victim. And it looks like patching, just the basics that we've heard about for so many years, still a big deal. Yeah.
So when you look at the below the rating, this company has poor cybersecurity hygiene, it's a D or an F, or this organization is very good cybersecurity hygiene, it's A rated. Well, what's behind that? When you look at those ransomware victims, and again, predominantly rated as D or F, having poor cybersecurity hygiene, in the area of software patching, when we just look at the subset of software vulnerabilities that are rated as critical or high severity, things that can be remotely exploited for system compromise, ransomware victims on the day of compromise or on the day of detonation, we found that they have an 11 times higher rate of high severity software patching issues in their internet-facing systems in comparison with the larger population. Now, when you look at services, which again is a very straight line vector by which criminals can gain unauthorized access to organizations, like RDP, Telnet, unsafe database listeners, ransomware victims have a 5 higher rate of unsafe network services in their internet-facing systems than the general population. And the story goes on. I mean, you look at the botnet activity that's emanating from these ransomware victims at the time of ransomware detonation, that's 9 times higher than the general population. So again, you see in the reality of the conditions of those systems, much poorer cybersecurity hygiene than the larger population. And it just speaks volumes to, I think there's a positive message in this. And, you know, there's a positive message that in this correlation that the work of cybersecurity professionals and risk management professionals to get good risk outcomes actually pays off. So if you're doing those things and investing in those activities, you're going to get better risk outcomes. And so I think we all get to make sense. It makes sense to us, but the data actually backs it up, probably even stronger than anyone suspected.
Right. And that gets to the idea of the supply chain security of vendors.
Mm-hmm.
People are so worried about. It's a major policy for government, and agencies are still figuring out, how am I going to really know the cybersecurity posture of my suppliers, software suppliers, services suppliers, beyond what they attest to? And it seems this is research that proves that you can not just have an attestation, but you can also verify that trust.
Yes. You know, I guess if you're looking for one rule for your supply chain, you know, managing risk in your supply chain, if you want to get better risk outcomes, lower rates of destructive ransomware events that take your supplier offline and impact your operations, or lower rates of just general breach events in your supply chain, which impact you. Do business with companies that have good cybersecurity hygiene. Okay, well, again, you know, we might be stating the obvious there, but you know, the data backs it up. But what you're saying is, how do you do that? Because organizations have such vast supply chains. I mean, if you look at the Department of Defense, wow, I mean, it's measured in the millions. It's huge. And you know, using open source intelligence and analytics, now certainly that doesn't replace attestation, because you need visibility into activities and management controls that you can't get through open source intelligence. But leveraging open source intelligence can help you understand how people, the process and technology that an organization invests in are manifest in the systems. You know, those systems that are facing the internet are pieces of evidence about the quality of their cybersecurity. You know, are they patching their systems? Are they, you know, blocking unsafe network services from the internet? Do they have controls in place to prevent infection and communication with botnet command and control servers, things like that? So you have a very good objective set of data to back up what's being attested to. The other part of it is that you can do this automatically. So you can light it up for your supply chain, the cybersecurity ratings and assessments, and see, hey, who's an A and who's an F. And the data shows that those with the high ratings, I mean, with said otherwise, good cybersecurity hygiene in internet-facing systems, have dramatically better risk outcomes. So you can then start to focus and say, hey, okay, you know, I have 1,000 or 10,000 suppliers that I'm concerned about. Well, you can narrow down your attention to those who present the greatest risk, those ones with the DNF ratings, which might be just a population of 10% or less, but you can focus your risk mitigation efforts on those areas that pose you to the greatest likelihood of things like destructive ransomware and just general cybersecurity breach. And that way you can get scale.
And just to bring this all together, then, what's your best advice for federal agencies who are charged with managing security of their software supply chains? And for that matter, not just their software supply chains, but the security of any supplier that might have their data, the agency's data in its possession, or drawings, or whatever the case might be, to make sure that you can trust in what it is they are doing with their systems that have your data.
First of all, and not necessarily presented in order of do this. This is the most important, but kind of rationally. Number one, settle in for the long haul, particularly as it relates to this threat of ransomware. There are 56 different criminal organizations that were publicly reported in the media as being behind these 1,000 ransomware events. So the threat is tremendous. And with destructive ransomware events, there's a shift in mindset and risk management that has to occur. And you have to look at your suppliers, not only from the risk of losing data, but also operational organizations that might have been previously low risk because they were manufacturing a bolt for you, for example. There's really no data risk there, but operationally, can you keep your supply chain operating without that? So you have to refactor the risk ratings through the lens of, hey, if this company goes down for a week or a month or disappears altogether, what's the impact to me? And so you have to look at it from that lens. As I said before, do business with companies that have good cybersecurity hygiene. I mean, it's not lip service anymore. The data backs it up. The viability of enterprises depends on this principle: do business with good companies that have good cybersecurity hygiene. So your third-party risk management program is absolutely essential to that. So them not only with technologies and staff to engage proactively with the suppliers through questionnaires and other assessments, but also use objective data. Arm them with data as you have in other areas. Arm them with data to say, hey, these suppliers are good, these suppliers are poorly. And in doing that, you're going to make your team more efficient. They're going to be able to focus their risk activities towards those that are the poorest performing. The other component is that when you bring forward that objective data to those suppliers, transparency, now you can have a different conversation. Now you're really holding them accountable. You can't just have a supplier answering a question, yes, I do patch and keep my systems free of important security issues. Now you have objective data that's, well, look like you do, and you need to do better. The last thing I'll say, Tom, is, and this is kind of an interesting byproduct of the study, is that when you're looking at those suppliers, make sure that they have 24/7 operations if they're important to you. Because what we found in the data, when we look at the date of ransomware detonation, is that 50% of the ransomware is detonated on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. And this is traditionally where organizations are least capable or least staffed to respond to these types of things. And there's even a correlation on holidays, where the days around the Christmas holidays, we see a 187% higher rate of security breaches of organizations. And around Thanksgiving, 140% higher than your average days. And so, the criminals are operating 24/7. They're taking advantage of companies that have very poor cybersecurity hygiene. And they're coupling that with having an increased focus when organizations have what may be less capability because of holidays or weekends to stage their attacks. So these are the advice that I would give to your listeners. We certainly have more in some of our research papers.
All right, some good actionable information from Kelly White, the founder and CEO of Recon, a MasterCard company. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.
And you're listening to Federal News Network. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. Let's go back to the studio for more of the Industry Exchange Cyber.